Hello there. I'm David Tickner, Chief Executive of the Civil Service Retirement Fellowship, and I'm delighted to welcome you to 60 Voices, a special podcast we've launched to celebrate our 60th anniversary. We'll be sharing the fascinating stories and personal reflections of former civil servants as they look back on their careers and the impact they had on the nation. 60 Voices will conserve and preserve these important work memories. From the challenges they faced to the memorable moments that define their work, each episode offers a unique personal insight into the history of the UK civil service and the people who shaped it. Whether you're a former colleague or someone interested in public service, we invite you to join us as we explore the voices behind decades of dedication, service, and legacy. Before we kick off, I'd like to introduce my co-host for the podcast, Denise Headley. Denise is the Civil Service Retirement Fellowship's Deputy Chief Executive and has an extensive background in broadcasting and commentary. So hello, Denise.
Hello, and thank you so much. It's lovely to see you, Fred.
And joining us for our second episode, I'm very pleased to introduce Fred Cook. Fred has been a member of the CSRF community since his retirement in 2011, and he is also an active member of our book groups. So a big welcome to you, Fred, as well.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Fred. I'm going to kick off with a very easy question to start the flow of our chat, which is two-part. The first part is what made you choose the civil service as a career? And second part, when you had joined, what departments or department were you working with?
Well, I joined the civil service in 1969. But before that, I'd previously worked for the Commercial Union Assurance Group in marine insurance in the City of London, where I made progress and was getting on okay, but I wasn't entirely sure in my own mind that this was going to be a career for life, because marine insurance in those days was a very strange environment where people wore bowler hats and were basically incredibly posh.
Did you wear a bowler hat?
I did not wear a bowler hat. I was too junior. But once you got on in that sort of environment, you in those days, 1965, this would have been, people were wandering up and down Lime Street, wearing bowler hats. Next door to our office was Lloyd's, the underwriting establishment, and people would come into our office seeking for us to sign a line of insurance. In other words, the insurance underwriter would insure a small percentage of the risk on something like a ship or some other sort of risk. So there was I working in insurance, and while I was there, I started doing the insurance exams, including an exam on law, where I did rather well, and I decided after a while that I wasn't really going to progress, perhaps, in insurance, because apart from the sort of atmosphere of marine insurance, which probably wasn't my forte, with all these posh people around. In the insurance world generally, the way to get on, I thought, was to be out in the local branches doing sales, and sales work wasn't really something that I saw myself as being particularly strong at. So in those days, the civil service certainly had a reputation for being a good employer, and so I sort of investigated that. And one of the options in the civil service was a job with the Estate Duty Office, which offered the opportunity to do law exams. And seeing as I'd already shown that I had was able to do quite well at law, I thought this might well be an opportunity. So that was where I started my civil service career in 1969.
I just could ask a quick question, Fred. You said so. You talked about the city of London. Could you just tell me just how it looked in that period? Because when you talk about people walking around with bowler hats, it seems rather antiquated to someone like myself. Because when I worked there years ago, but it was very much still the tailored suits and that whole atmosphere of poshness. I don't know if you can just give me your thoughts about how it looked and that whole.
Well, it was
vibe.
certainly posh on the marine insurance side, and people had upper crust accents. People wore stiff collars. In fact, someone used to come into the office once a week with a supply of stiff white collars for people to use as their supply.
You put them on afterwards, or
Put them on over a striped shirt. So the collar was separate collar with a stud, and underneath that you would wear your possibly a striped shirt with a so these collars were quite stiff and stark, and so there was that sort of general atmosphere. I mean, the underwriter in charge at the time was. When you saw his name in writing, it was Hogsflesh, but we had to call him Boufflé.
I don't get that. Sorry.
I think it's the spelling, isn't it, Fred? So it was spelt as though you.
It was spelt Hogsflesh, but you certainly didn't call him Mr. Hogsflesh. You called him Mr. Boufflé.
Oh, I see. Was that? Did people make you feel that you were part of that sort of community in a certain?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't posh at all. I was just from southeast London. I went to school at Blackheath.
Just up the road.
Lovely around here.
Just up the road from your office. Yeah, Rose School for Boys, which is on Maze Hill, next door to Greenwich Park. And we weren't a posh school. We were a grammar school, but we weren't posh.
I thought so, because when you talked about the exams, I was going to ask you, did you do the 11 class?
Oh yes. You had to do the 11 plus to get into Roan School, and you went along for an interview, and I think the headmaster was quite sympathetic to people who perhaps weren't from the poshest background. So I got into Roan School and got my A levels, and then in those days, not that many people went to university, so the majority of people left grammar school with A levels and then found a job. And quite a number of my friends at school found jobs in the city because we weren't living too far away from the city of London. So you were that short commute in every day. And there were quite a few jobs going in City of London banks, and in my case, insurance company.
I think that's interesting. What you're talking about Blackheath and recalling your memories, because part of the reason that we're doing this podcast is actually to get those oral histories, and that they're there for posterity, for want of a better word. So it's I'm very pleased that we're.
Fred, what was Greenwich like? I mean, in the 60s. I mean, obviously Greenwich now is almost probably unrecognisable. Have you been back to Greenwich in living memory? I mean, when was the last time you had a walk round your old haunts?
About 5, 6, 7 years ago, perhaps.
Yeah.
I mean, the biggest in my day, we were allowed out from school at lunchtime to wander around Greenwich Park, and of course, in those days, when we looked down across the Thames, there was the Isle of Dogs with no sign of Canary Wharf and the skyscrapers. So. But it was a very interesting place to go to school because if you had time, you could go into the Maritime Museum at the bottom of the hill, and have a quick look around Queen's House or one of the galleries there. And Greenwich Park, as you know, is quite a sort of interesting place. It's got lots of hills and wooded areas. There was at the top on the Blackheath end, there was an enclosure with deer and duck which I presume is still there.
When we last saw it, it had a rather suspect-looking unicorn and a bee wandering around.
We did our walk for friendship, so it was really good to be there. I just wanted to pick up on another point, and it's about your expectation, because when you spoke earlier, you said that one of the reasons you joined the civil service was because it had grades, and also that it was a job for life. And that is something I think that people who have come subsequent into the civil service they don't have that as an expectation anymore. But it's interesting that that was one of your drivers that you went into the civil service, because you knew you could progress and it was a job for life, effectively.
I think in 1965 people did see themselves as joining a career for life. I know nowadays things have changed quite a lot, but in those days I think it was quite common to think that you were going to join a particular organisation, and if you did well enough, you would stay there and progress. And certainly, the civil service and the part of the civil service I joined, the estate duty office, had this sort of structure where you could progress. If you there was a sort of guarantee of promotion if you, as long as you passed the law exams, you knew that you were going to at least get one grade up, and there was a structure there that you could see. But if you worked hard enough and did well enough, you could sort of go up the various steps of the ladder. So
it was more meritocracy? It was more like the meritocracy than your previous, the marine.
Yeah, that's the impression. That's certainly the impression I had at the time, and I think that proved to be the case, because you were judged you were looked at every year. Yeah. You had an annual report, and you were told how well or badly you had done, and where you needed to improve, or what you had done well, and so on. So you could see that you were being considered on an annual basis, and there was also, in those days, it seemed that we were able to get on quite quickly, because it was only after a couple of years that I was moved from one part of the state duty office to another, and that was a sign of that you were that someone at the top regarded you as sort of doing well.
The CSRF, the Civil Service Retirement Fellowship, is a charity set up for civil servants by civil servants. In 1960, Douglas Houghton MP highlighted the need for an organisation that supported retired civil servants, offering friendship and companionship. 59 years later, we are still carrying on his dream. You can find out more about the CSRF at our website, www.csrf.org.uk. Why not sign up to become a digital donor for £3, less than the price of coffee? Or you may wish to volunteer. Contact us via the website.
So I just wanted to pick up. I mean, obviously, it's been very interesting to hear the sort of when you went from school, you went into insurance, obviously then looked to the civil service as a career. Do you remember the entry process to getting into the civil service? Because when we were talking with Jean, one of the people we interviewed in the previous podcast, she had some very vivid memories of obviously the selection process, and obviously there was an entrance exam, and I think, if memory serves me correct, she had to go all the way down to Bristol, and she got lost in the melee when she was going down to Bristol. Was it a similar process for you, Fred, when you were joining? I mean, was there a map of what you needed to do to obviously get through the door in the first place?
I don't remember any examination as such. What I think the requirement was that you had a certain level of academic achievement, so that if you had, for example, a sufficient number of A levels, that you were within the field for being considered. And the entry process that I remember consisted of 2 interviews. One was at the Civil Service Commission, where I can't remember where that was, somewhere in central London, where you were asked a number of general questions about current affairs and so on, to see whether you could provide intelligent answers to questions. I can't really remember what questions were asked. I do remember that they were about, it was basically which newspaper you had read, and then current. So
it's to one assume that if you put the Daily Mirror, you would be a.
I don't think I said the Daily Mirror. I think I said the Manchester Guardian, or whatever it was called at the time, which was an honest answer, because I'd been reading that ever since the Daily. Well, in fact, I've read that ever since the News Chronicle was cease publication, and one day someone popped the Daily Mail through my front door. But there are general questions like that. And then after that, they came up with the possibility of a job in the estate duty office where you had to have a subsequent interview. And that was at Shepherd's Bush.
Oh, right.
Which is where the estate duty office was at the time. And it was an interview with, I think, 3 grade 7s, including what was then called the establishment officer. That's the HR nowadays. And that again, it was a series of questions. And the only one there are 2 questions I remember. One was about my holiday in a recent holiday I'd taken in North Wales on a canal. And I had trouble remembering the name of the aqueduct, which I still can't say. I still pontifically feel whatever it's called.
Yeah.
And near Llandudno. And the other question was of what I'd done in my life of which I was most proud. And I just gave a sort of fairly non-committal answer to that, saying I wasn't particularly proud of anything, but I always try to do my best. And that seemed to...
That's a good answer. That seems like a very good response. They obviously worked, though, Fred. They were.
Well, they let me in, and I they obviously told me about what I could expect, because in those days you had to then undergo about 6 months of training, technical training on how to do the job. And I'm pleased to say I did quite well at that. And then you were let loose on a limited number of cases. And then you had to go to the City of London Polytechnic 1 day a week for 3 years to study law.
Oh, right. But am I right in thinking, just so I'm clear, I mean, it's very interesting, this entry process, because obviously, the way people apply for jobs. When you applied, were you applying specifically for the department you wanted to work in? Or were you applying generically to enter the civil service? And once
generically, at first generically to join the civil service. And I suppose at that time I hadn't made any commitment. So I was sort of still investigating whether I really wanted to do this. And then the next stage, as I said, was this offer of being considered for a job in the estate duty office. And that did appeal to me because, as I've said, it offered the opportunity to study law, which I thought was an interesting subject. And it did seem to offer the opportunity to progress if one sort of worked hard and did well.
And your legal acumen certainly came in useful, as we can see, as we'll pick up on a bit later. Dee, go for it.
I was just going to ask, Fred, did they pay for your degree as well?
Yes, it was all, you got 1 day off a week. 1 day off a week to study, and they adjusted for the amount of work that you were given to allow for the fact you were 1 day a week at college. And yes, I mean, all the fees were paid for by the department, by the civil service department. And I mean, there were penalties to all of this, because if you failed these exams, you were going to be removed from the estate duty office. And this is the threat they held over your head. They were going to send you off to do surtax, which I was never quite sure why everyone was frightened about doing surtax. But the what's surtax? Well, surtax was a sort of it was a sort of income tax for those people who earned more than a certain amount of money. So it was a sort of chopper to income tax, and it was
It's like the Vauxhall Conference League part of the HMRC.
Okay.
And it was administered separately from income tax, which was done in tax districts around the country. Surtax was done in a central office at somewhere called Hinchley Wood in southwest London.
Right.
Okay.
So if you lived like I did, by that time we were living in Bushy, Hertfordshire. So the idea of having to trail off to do surtax at Hinchley Wood in southwest London had no appeal whatsoever. So I tried to make sure I passed the exams.
Very sensible.
Very sensible.
Do you remember your first day in the civil service, Fred? How it ran? When you passed all the exams, you'd leapt through all the hoops. Do you remember day one when you arrived? How your first day went?
I think I don't have particularly strong memories. I remember being asked to see one of the deputy controllers, who more or less said, "Why on earth do you want to come and work here?" said,
Justify your application.
You gave the impression that it was a not particularly wise decision. So that left me a bit worried. But the other thing was, I remember then being sent along to the training chief examiner. That's a grade 7, and it was impressed upon me how you had to be deferential to your superiors. So when I mean, this is 1969, and
Yeah.
I think the country was still had more of a mood of deference than it does now. So when you were told that when your chief examiner, that's your grade 7, walked into the room, you had to stand up.
Wow.
And when if a higher grade person, for example, an assistant controller, walked in, you had to sort of
Kneel
really
down, no doubt.
almost kneel down.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, when I managed to get promoted to that sort of level, no one ever stood up or showed such deference to me.
Shame on them, Fred. So what did you remember about your, I mean, obviously you started your career, and from what we gather, you worked your whole civil service career within the same arena. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean,
Department.
I spent the whole time in the estate duty office or its successors, with just one sort of or two exceptions where I was seconded to what was the policy side of what was then, it was still the Inland Revenue, which was at Somerset House in those days, and that's when that was in 1972 onwards, I think. And it was just before the Labour Party won the 1974 general election. And so when I got there, I didn't really have an awful lot of work to do, which I found somewhat dispiriting. But all of a sudden, there was a lot of work to do because the 1974 Labour government replaced estate duty with what was then called capital transfer tax. It's now inheritance tax, which in those days involved a lot of gifts on all tax on all lifetime gifts, not just those made within 7 years of death. So that it meant there was a big expansion of the tax, and there was quite a lot of work to be done.
Can I just ask you a quick question in relation to, you spoke here about you organized the move of 144 SVD staff from London to Nottingham. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that effectively, what do you recall from that in terms of how you had to negotiate with people, the training that you had to offer? Because you said here it was very complex and there were a lot of people involved, there were a lot of moving parts. Could you just give us a little flavor of that?
Yeah, the Inland Revenue had decided it wanted to move quite a large part of its operational head office to Nottingham, in order to really to save money on London accommodation. So we were at Shepherd's Bush, and we were going to be moved to Nottingham, first into temporary accommodation, and later into a brand new building that was being built in the centre of Nottingham. And my role in this was to organise the move of my part of the department, which was shares, that part of what was then the Capital Taxes Office, called Shares Valuation Division, which involved all the staff who were engaged on valuing assets such as unquoted shares, goodwill, bloodstock, Lloyd's underwriting interests, etc., etc. And I did that by organising a working party of grade 7s who were working to me, and going through the nitty-gritty of all of the procedural and organisational adjustments that we would have to make. So we had to, obviously, we were told which building we were going to be moving into, but clearly having been told that, it was up to us to sort out who would sit where, which part of the of shares valuation division would sit in which part of the building, how we would organise ourselves, how we were going to move all of our files from London to Nottingham, and how we were going to organise the teams of people up there who would sit where, and so on. So we managed to do that through a series of meetings that I held with the various team leaders, and I'm pleased to say that it went extremely well, because we were the one part of the estate duty office that had people at their desks working on day one, rather than there being any sort of chaos or confusion.
Super efficient, Fred. Was your office all open plan? I mean, were they all open plan, or did people, was it everyone had little offices and all?
It wasn't entirely open plan, because I was still fortunate, for example, to have an office of my own. And other
You had a door.
I had a door. In fact, I had a room of my own for most of my career. It was only towards the very end that I was forced out into the open.
How did that work for you, being forced out into the open?
That must be a bit of a shock to the system, Fred.
No, it was, I found it fine. I must admit, I know nowadays you don't even get a desk of your own. It's all, you
Hot desking.
Hot desk, and you find a desk when you get there. And I'm not sure I would have adjusted to that, but
it's very unnerving, actually, when we've been in to do departmental events in some of the big Whitehall buildings now. You talk to serving civil servants, and they're often say they're told to come in waves because there's not enough space for them. So you have sort of like shift patterns of people, some people coming in at 9 and some people coming in at 10. And then they're sort of in these sort of breakout pods and on the staircase and on the floor. And you sort of think, well, obviously that's great for shrinking a footprint, but if you still got a large number of people who need a desk to actually do a job, it's not exactly ideal. But I think probably these days, Fred, I would suspect even perm secs don't necessarily have their own offices anymore. I mean, they probably have breakout rooms and they can have private meetings, but I would think that most of them are now all in an open plan.
Yeah, I mean, my son actually works for shares valuation division.
Oh, Johnny, you kept it in the family.
It's nepotism, yes, run right. And when he wants to do when he's, for example, negotiating with the taxpayer, he's allowed to be at home for 40% of the week. So when he wants his own room to do something quite like that, he's in the study upstairs doing it from home. So I know what it's like.
As an extension to Dee's question about the move, I couldn't help but be caught by the little afternote in your question about what departments you work for, which is your extremely important work chairing the Office Wine Society, which sounds like, and not only chairing the office, it had its own shop. You need to explain more, Fred. Was this filthy lucre that are being confiscated from people who hadn't paid their taxes or appropriately that was being stoled on, or not? No?
No. It was this shop had been operating in the estate duty office in Shepherd's Bush for some considerable time, and it was self-financing. I don't know how the sort of original capital was raised, but basically, it was a shop that was open for 1 hour each lunchtime. So the people who are interested in buying decent wine could buy it from the office shop. We were able to buy wine quite often at reasonable prices or at a discount from suitable sources. And I was the chair of the wine club that ran the shop for quite a few years.
That sounds like a very enjoyable role to occupy, Fred.
Well, we also had a wine circle, which used to do wine tasting once a month in the evening after work.
And you were walking in circles after the wine tasting, I should imagine.
We did have a bit of a problem when we moved this wine shop from London to Nottingham, because there we were on a site with other offices, and so which included HR. So someone from HR decided that
What's HR? Oh, HR, did you say?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
HR,
Okay.
human
All right.
resources. And they started questioning whether this wine shop was appropriate, although it had official approval for some considerable years. And we were told, it might sort of take away trade from a local wine shop, which was nowhere really near the route where people into the office would walk. We were only open for 1 hour a day, and we weren't open to the public. It was just for people who worked on site, so we weren't taking away anyone's custom. It was suggested we were going to perhaps upset the local MP, Kenneth Clark, who was then the Chancellor's Exchequer.
Oh, wow.
I should have thought. I mean, Kenneth Clark was quite notorious for enjoying a glass.
Well, first of all, I don't think he would have been upset if he had found out.
Exactly.
Secondly, we weren't in his constituency. We were actually in Nottingham South rather than Rushden.
He would have
So
probably applauded
I
your
got-
entrepreneurial skills.
Yes, I got rather cross with HR and told them to either stop asking questions or tell me what their objections were, and then they went away and we never heard any more from. We were allowed to carry on, and it's no longer there, this wine shop, because
I was
they've
going to
moved
say, is it
buildings.
still running? So your son is not
They've
able
moved
to...
into yet another building where they were told there wasn't sufficient room for such.
That's a shame, really.
Well,
And
in
it was-
a way,
When you look at that, that's a bit of a shame, because essentially the wine circle and the opportunity to go and buy wine and talk about wine, it created a different type of community where you were working. I mean, are you by any chance in contact with anyone from that wine circle, or has it informed your flavors now? I mean, are you still a wine enthusiast?
Yeah, I still like my wine and still buy wine. The wine circle is still going now. They meet in a
that's
local
fabulous.
pub. I don't belong to it anymore, but yes, the wine circle is still going, and it was a very useful. I thought it was quite a good thing, because it gave people the opportunity. It wasn't a question of drinking lots of wine just for the sake of it. It was an educative experience too, because you could try wines that you wouldn't normally have bought, and
Yeah.
and that people enjoyed it, and I think it was good for morale.
The CSRF, the Civil Service Retirement Fellowship, is a charity set up for civil servants by civil servants. In 1960, Douglas Houghton MP highlighted the need for an organisation that supported retired civil servants, offering friendship and companionship. 59 years later, we are still carrying on his dream. You can find out more about the CSRF at our website, www.csrf.org.uk. Why not sign up to become a digital donor for £3, less than the price of coffee? Or you may wish to volunteer. Contact us via the website.
Now, I know you said earlier on in the chat that we had, that when you were asked a question about your proudest moment in life, you said, "Oh, I haven't had any to recount." I'm sure if we asked you the same question in reflection of your 40-plus year career in the civil service, you would be able to pinpoint a couple of moments in your career. I mean, probably there are many moments that you probably think that was a major achievement. All of what, your journey, from what we've heard so far, is amazingly interesting to hear, and obviously listen to how you've moved from where you started to where you ended up. But if we were going to say to you, pull out a couple of moments in your career as a civil servant that you were particularly memorable / proud of, what would you pick for us, Fred?
I think one would be the fact that I was asked to become the chief of what in those days was called management services within the estate duty office. In those days, the Inland Revenue was very much decentralized, and so each part very much managed its own business. So the Capital Taxes Office managed all sorts of things itself. It managed for example, quite a lot of its own human resources and management of the building it occupied, and so on. And the job that I had in management services was to take control of the procedure, not only things like building, but the technical procedures so I would be sitting there drafting instructions for how people should do their work on tax as well, and redesigning the office forms, for example, the Inland Revenue accounts that people had to fill in to account for their tax, etc., etc. And one of the jobs I had in that role was to introduce a new computer system. And I'd never touched a computer. When I was asked if I would do this job as Chief of Management Services, I was told about this computer project, and approached that with a certain amount of trepidation, because I'd never ever touched a computer in my life. And this is this is back in the sort of early 80s, where computer, it's a long time ago. People didn't use computers very much in those days. And the selection process for jobs in those days seemed to be on whether someone regarded you as being bright enough to do a job rather than your competencies, which is a sort of a test that they use nowadays. So anyway, I got on with this computer project, and did a few courses myself in computing. But the main part of that job was to sort of make absolutely clear to the people who were doing the computer work what our requirements were, and to make sure that those requirements were being met in the way that we would want them to be. So I was quite proud that after a few years of doing that work, we got a computer system up and running on its first day within budget, and it worked perfectly well. And I produced all the instructions for the ordinary members of staff, as it were, on how they should use it. We had training courses. We had a group of people who were available to help the staff if any problems arose. And we met various hurdles along the way. For example, asbestos in one room that had to be amended. And I had the unions on my back telling me that I was going to give everybody cancer. And so,
did you change your view? Did it change your view of computers, having gone through that IT setup? Were you?
Well, I learned. I'm not sure it changed my view. I think I'm not sure I had one at the beginning. I learned quite a lot. Yes, I mean, and strangely enough, after 40 years, even now today, this computer system is still there in operation. And
I think that's really interesting that it's actually there and still in operation, friend.
well, in partial operation, yeah, they don't use all of its facilities, but they're still using some of them. And I mean, it says something perhaps about how archaic the revenue systems are.
Well, I wouldn't say, okay, I hear what you're saying about archaic, but I think it also points to legacy, which is really what 60 Voices is about. It's about showing that people who have maybe, not necessarily the people that you see at the very front of the civil service, but there is a whole army of individuals who basically make that system work, and it's still working today. So I think that's it's legacy, and I think that's an excellent way of just thinking about what we're even doing today.
Fred, were all the when you? I mean, presumably the upshot was it that everyone had an individual computer, or
No, not it was mainly a computer for recording where every file in the office was at any one time.
oh,
And
right, I'm
what
with you.
they and what where, so it was a file move. It was an indexation tool. It was a file movements tool, and it was a file review tool. So in those days, because it was a very strange office. It was built on a railway line with lots of little rooms where people who did the technical work did their job, and then there were registries who were responsible for having the keeping of files when before post came in to be handled, and so it was mainly the registry staff who had the computers at that stage, although there were computers in other parts of the office as well. Individual computers was a sort of later development. But this computer system is still there, and you can still access it now through everyone does now have their own computer, but you can still access it through the individual computers that people now have.
I also think, just before Dee, I know Dee's got a question, so I'm sorry, I was just on the proudest moments. I seem to recall there was also another part of your career that you mentioned about your proud element of, you know, getting your law qualification and obviously the legal side. Wasn't there a moment which your experience in litigation and the court arena came to play, where you scored a Pyrrhic victory, so to speak?
The last 10 years of my career was spent as the head of a litigation team.
Yeah.
In shares valuation division. And when I started that job, my fear was that shares valuation had a reputation for being rather reluctant to take contentious cases to a tribunal or to court, and that in the outside world there were tax practitioners who would play on that and just be as obstinate as they could be, in order to hope for the day when shares valuation would come to some sort of capitulation and just give in. So my overriding aim in that job was to try and establish an impression in the outside world that shares valuation would be prepared to take worthwhile contentious cases to litigation, where there was sufficient tax involved and where we had a good, strong case. So there were a couple of cases of which I perhaps took some sort of rather unpleasant pride in, that there were in each of them there were well-known tax practitioners who had established a certain reputation, and they perhaps thought that we weren't going to take these particular cases to appeal, but we did. And I remember one of these practitioners, I obviously won't name anyone, telling me at a sort of general meeting we had with tax practitioners that he couldn't understand why I was taking this case. And he also later on suggested that I'd been grossly insulting because I had to him, because I had accused him of behaviour which I didn't really think was appropriate, which was trying to persuade a tax lawyer in Scotland to change his view on a particular point of law. And when that case went to the hearing in Edinburgh, the judge found in our favour and decided on values which were exactly the ones we had asked for, which is quite unusual, because normally the judge would find some figure somewhere between the two sides, and also gave this tax practitioner an admonishment for precisely the things that I had told him off about. Though I'm afraid that gave me some perverse satisfaction.
Quite right,
Oh.
too.
I don't think so, because really what you were doing, you were basically safeguarding the public purse. And somebody was taking advantage of that because of custom and practice. And I think what you were saying there is that you came along with your, your approach to work, and essentially it meant that they were going to act in an appropriate way. So I think, it's good to sometimes get that little pat on the back, especially with someone who's external, seeing what you're doing. So I've got a quick question for you. What would you say is one of your funniest moments that you've had in your career, or one of your most, you spoke there of one of your most, satisfying moments, but what made you laugh or chuckle at something at work that's memorable?
I can tell you about something that made me almost cry.
Okay, go on then.
Uh, I, 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 in my days when I was actually doing share valuation, at an earlier stage of my career, I got involved in valuing quite a few breweries, and so in those days there still are quite a number of family-owned breweries, and of course sometimes if there had been someone had died owning shares or gave away shares, these shares came up for valuation. And then when I went off to Somerset House to do policy work, I was asked. I did my spell there and got a promotion at the end. Then they asked me back for about 5 months because they were getting lots and lots of correspondence about what this new capital transfer tax meant in various regards. And one of these letters came in for me, and so my job was to sort of draft responses for ministers to send to the letters. One letter was, which is of particular interest, or to me at least, was that Roy Mason, the then MP for Barnsley, had in his constituency a brewery called Barnsley Bitter, and he had written a letter to Harold Wilson, the then Prime Minister, worrying about the effect of this new capital transfer tax on his local brewery, and so I had to draft a response for Harold Wilson to send back to Roy Mason.
Wow.
Which is fine, except that I was also at the time in my personal private life was a member of the campaign for Real Ale. And a group of my friends had arranged that year that we should go to the Camera annual general meeting, which this is before we moved as an office to Nottingham. I didn't know at the time that was ever going to happen. But the AGM was in Nottingham, at Nottingham University. And at the end of this meeting, someone raised a point about the effect of inheritance capital transfer tax on breweries, and someone had given the chairman of this meeting a copy of this letter that Harold Wilson had sent to Roy Mason, and this letter was the one it was basically the same as I drafted it, which was supposed to be quite good thing. But it wasn't good because everyone booed what they.
Did you confess to anyone, or if they listen to the podcast, they're only now going to find out?
I kept my peace. But it's a bit like the argument that's going on now about inheritance tax on
the farmers.
Because at that time there was no in the first when capital transfer tax was first introduced, there was no agricultural relief, and there was no business relief, and that was changed a year later. So a year later, the situation was changed when the government changed its mind. But I had to defend the policy decision that had been taken at that point, and so I did find that rather embarrassing that I was the subject to all this trouble at Emory. Yeah.
I wonder if any one of them is going to listen to the podcast, because now it will be revealed what the true identity of the person who's crafted the letter, potentially. Okay, I've got another thought for you. Tell me what you've enjoyed about your retirement and what you've been doing since you've retired, and maybe some of the, your highlights potentially.
When I retired, I thought I better find something to keep the brain cells active.
Yeah.
And I was 65 when I retired, and so I thought to myself, you can sort of easily go into dotage if you sort of sit around and do nothing. So after a few months, I looked around and volunteered through a website called Reach Volunteering, and found a job with the campaign Tech Rural England, who were looking for a treasurer for their Nottinghamshire branch. So I volunteered. I volunteered to do that, and they took me on without too much. I had to go for an interview, but I think they were going to grab almost anyone, so they grabbed me. And obviously, I was able to say I had some experience of finance from my shares valuation experience, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And when I got there, I found that this organisation wasn't big. I mean, this all sounds terribly arrogant. It wasn't being terribly well run. So I used to put in my pennyworth at committee meetings. The constitution that they operated under was a rather ridiculous one, for reasons I won't bore you with now. But so I got that changed, and after a year or so, they asked if I would be prepared to be the chair. So I did become. I became acting chair, and then I was elected at the next AGM as chair, and I did that for nearly a decade.
Wow.
I did quite a lot of. It took up quite a lot of time, and I did all sorts of things like arrange the use of social media. I tried to establish contacts with the local universities to get younger people interested in, to try and recruit volunteers. I organised the East Midlands conference on affordable homes to try and persuade local councillors to encourage the building of affordable homes in their local villages, etc.
Very good.
And got involved with making representations to local councils about various matters. Particularly, we got organised. We got involved in an anti-fracking campaign, because at that time they were talking about. I think fracking sort of died a death knell, but there were prospects of fracking taking place in places like Clumber Park, which is one of the Dukery sites in Nottinghamshire.
Okay.
President Trump may be putting it back on the agenda. President-elect Trump is maybe putting fracking back.
Well, Liz Truss wanted to do it, but I'm not sure there's a great deal of interest in it in this country at the moment, anyway.
Mm. Are you still involved with the rural project for England?
I'm still a member, but I'm not. My time in office, I had explained. In fact, I had overrun the time. COVID enabled me to stay in office because we couldn't have an AGM. But the rules of governance were that you had to give up being chair after a certain number of years. So my time had come. And, I obeyed the rules and gave up. But I'm still a member. Yes.
And have you picked up anything else in any other sort of capacity and roles, as opposed to? I mean, this was very involved. But are you doing any other elements that you're?
I just do a bit of leaflet delivering for a local political party, and I spend quite a lot of time reading now because David introduced me to his book club, which I think is a really good thing, and that sort of keeps me busy in the evenings reading a book that I may have
broadened your reading habits, Fred. I mean, I think you said yourself at the beginning, it's challenged you to pick up books that you ordinarily would not have selected.
That's true.
Diplomatically.
I mean, we've just read something called Cold Comfort Farm, which
did you enjoy that?
No. And I wasn't in a minority either in taking that.
I think that may be, if memory serves me correct, that may be a choice of Ms. Rowe, whose batting average for picking books that the book group have not wholly warmed to seems to be extending.
Good though. That's excellent. I think, having a book group also helps to keep you in touch with people. And, like you're saying, you're going to pick up books that you're not necessarily going to, pick yourself, because you tend to pick the same thing because you know what you like. Whereas if somebody else picks it for you, it's not exactly the same.
Exactly.
I would probably tend to read non-fiction rather than fiction. So it has forced me to read more fiction, and I'm glad of that. And
Yeah.
it doesn't do you any harm to read a book that you would not have chosen yourself. And even Cold Comfort Farm, although some of us were a bit dismissive about it, it was an interesting read. And at least I now know where the expression "I saw something nasty in a woodshed."
Woodshed, yes, exactly. On that, just very quickly as a sidebar, the book, the BBC did do a TV adaptation of Cold Comfort Farm that had like a stellar cast of Ian McKellen, Kate Beckinsale, etc. And I think it looks better as a TV adaptation visually on screen than it actually is when you're actually reading the book. So if you haven't seen it, I would say it is worth watching. I have got one quick question as we're drawing to a close, Fred, because obviously coming up to the top of the hour, is do you remember how you discovered the Civil Service Retirement Fellowship? I mean, was that something that you came across? Was it something that was well advertised when you were going through your retirement preparations?
There was a retirement course given to everyone who was coming up to retirement, and as part of that course, the retirement fellowship was mentioned as one of the organisations that one might want to join. And I just sort of looked at it and thought, well, why not? It wasn't going to cost me an awful lot of money, and it looked as though it's something worthwhile sort of taking an interest in. So I signed up, and here we are.
Yeah.
You get our fellowship news that comes through twice a year as well.
Yes.
Excellent, because I think that's one of the really important ways that we're able to stay, connected to our community is through our literature, through our activities. What would you say if you had like a closing message to anyone approaching retirement and who is currently going through retirement? What would you say are the things that people need to, or one or two things that they need to keep hold of as a way of having a good retirement?
I would say if you've made friends in the civil service, keep in touch with them. I'm very lucky. I've got a group of people I meet on a Friday, most Fridays, for a pint or two of beer at lunchtime, and we mull over. We put the world to rights, and that's a good. I think keeps you in touch with other people. But I would say find something to do, and whatever it is, something that keeps the brain cells active, keeps you in touch with other people, and hopefully stops you from being lonely.
Oh, that's lovely, Trey. That's gorgeous.
And that is a very, very good message to wind this episode up. So I'd just like to say, obviously, on behalf of us, a huge thank you, Fred, for giving your time this afternoon. It's always very interesting to listen to people's life journeys, to listen to what they've experienced, to listen to what they've learned, and also the very end. It's been thoroughly entertaining, as I knew it would be, Fred. I have to say.
I've enjoyed it, and thank you for the opportunity.
No, it's a pleasure.
Oh, lovely. It was a joy. Thanks very much, Fred.
Thanks, Fred. And just before you disappear, I'd just like to say to everybody listening, thank you very much for spending time with us on the second episode of the 60 Voices Project. If you liked this episode, there is another one you can listen to, and they will be growing on a weekly, monthly, fortnightly basis as we add more people to the list. So do feel free to have a read of anything you see on our website, csrf.org.uk. And if you'd like to be considered to be interviewed, we'd love to hear from you. You can find the contact information of how to get in touch with us on the CSRF website. So thank you very much for tuning in, and we look forward to joining you for our next episode.
The CSRF, the Civil Service Retirement Fellowship, is a charity set up for civil servants by civil servants. In 1960, Douglas Houghton MP highlighted the need for an organisation that supported retired civil servants offering friendship and companionship. 59 years later, we are still carrying on his dream. You can find out more about the CSRF at our website, www.csrf.org.uk. Why not sign up to become a digital donor for £3, less than the price of coffee? Or you may wish to volunteer. Contact us via the website.